This is a German chronicle of the late 16th century, which is now British Library Additional Manuscript 16280. As you can see, the text is in the form of a flagellum. Each of the 195 strips of vellum making up the scourge contains on front and back a brief note recording a key event in a particular year. The annals are written in different coloured inks. Here are some detailed views of this flagellum chronicle. It seems that the leaves were created by cutting up an existing text. The end of each leaf has been painted with a metallic colour, as if to strengthen the scourge and make its lashes more painful. We know very little about the origins and purpose of this remarkable object. The metaphor's clear, the scourge of time and history. But who made this object and why? We don't know. It seems too flimsy for use as a real scourge, and there's no evidence of its actual use in this way. It seems to have been made for contemplation or decoration, or maybe as a prop in a parade or a play. This flagellum illustrates the inventiveness and versatility of pre-modern scribes and the variety of textual objects they produced, which could be, as in this case, almost like concrete poetry. How can digitization help us better understand this object? If you analysing it manually, it's very difficult to manually record the contents of each of the strips. It's difficult to keep track of where you are. If we could digitize each one, it might be easier to keep track. We could then perhaps reconstruct the leaves which made up the scourge. This would give us a better idea of the sequence of colours used and the nature of the original text. But to do so, we would ideally want an interface which perhaps is slightly different to those that we're used to, which enabled us to compare and sort the images, almost in the way of using a lightbox, for example. The flagellum manuscript reminds us of the bewildering variety of shapes and structures produced by medieval scribes. The pride taken by medieval scribes in creating new manuscript structures is evident in the development of the tripartite indenture in the English royal courts in the 12th century to provide verifiable records of legal agreements. Two-part chirographs had been used in the royal court throughout the 12th century, and in this example from 1195, the exuberant lettering of the word chirograph across the indenture reflects the scribe's enthusiasm for this textual innovation as a means of helping to determine authenticity. This scribal pride in administrative and textual inventiveness is even more evident in this document from later in 1195, when this was the first tripartite fine formally archived in the Royal Treasury, as is explained in the endorsement. This is the first chirograph that was made in the King's Court in the form of 3 choreographs, according to the command of his Lordship of Canterbury, Hubert Walter, and other barons of the King, to the end that by this form a record can be made to be passed to the Treasurer to be put in the Treasury. In this way was inaugurated an archival series which then ran continuously to 1837. The codex was just one of many shapes that medieval texts could assume. Yet in digitization, we consistently privilege the codex. I'd like to illustrate something of the range and variety of the shape of medieval texts and suggest that in thinking about digitization, we need to go beyond creating simulacra of codices, which are a small and unrepresentative part of medieval scribal culture. The bulk of medieval scribal production, at least in England, looks something more like this. These students are consulting a plea roll of one of the central royal courts, the Court of Common Pleas. By the early 15th century, these huge rolls regularly consisted of nearly 500 membranes, each one about a metre in length. One such roll was produced for each law term, 4 a year. While these rolls were compiled by teams of clerks from the court, nevertheless, the effort in producing them was astonishing. You may recall, for example, how quite recently The great bulk of the celebrated 8th century codex Amiatinus created something of a sensation when it was exhibited in the British Library's Anglo-Saxon exhibition. But the late medieval Court of Common Pleas, admittedly under very different circumstances, was producing rolls much larger than the Codex Amiatinus every couple of months. The Common Pleas roll is not exceptional. Other government courts and offices, such as the Chancery, Exchequer and King's Bench, also produced large and elaborate rolls and maintained complex filing systems. Royal grants and orders were recorded on large annual rolls sewn head to foot, like this close roll from Richard II's reign, where a copy of the agreement relating to Chaucer's Raptus of Cecily-Champagne is recorded. Nicholas Vincent has calculated that for the period up to 1485, there were 46,000 rolls just like this in the 31 main series of rolls produced by the English government, an enormous quantity of vellum, parchment and writing. For most inhabitants of late medieval England, their textual encounters were more likely to be with rolls in all their various forms rather than the codex. Rolls were the stuff of everyday business. When an unexpected death occurred or a body was found, the inquest and any liability would be recorded by the coroner in a roll like these examples from Wiltshire, dating from the 1340s, and from Yorkshire in the 1370s. Judicial interaction between the Crown and local communities would be recorded and tracked in enormous detail in a roll such as this, the plea roll of the London Heir of 1276, now among the British Library additional charters. Among the annotators of this document was Andrew Horne, City Chamberlain from 1320 to 8, one of the most learned lawyers of his time. It's been argued that we need to study the books collected and used by Horne, and that fragments might assist in this in order to understand the compilation of his legal treatises, but it is just as important that we also pay attention to his use of rolls such as this. For most of the inhabitants of England, perhaps the most familiar textual objects would be manorial records, such as this example of a manorial roll from Conisbrough in South Yorkshire. These rolls recorded the services, fines and obligations of the tenants of all the manors which covered England. They defined the everyday life of large swathes of the English population. Their importance in everyday life is reflected in the way in which one of the characteristic protest actions in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was the burning of manorial documents such as this. Closely linked to the roll as a familiar textual object is the charter. This is a grant, which I could only reproduce from Lynn Mooney and Estelle's Stubbs' book, I'm afraid, but it's a grant in the hand of the scribe of the Hengot and Ellesmere manuscripts of the Canterbury Tales, identified by Lynn Mooney as Adam Pinkhurst, and it relates to the grant of land in Edmonton and Tottenham, just to the north of London. Adam Pinkhurst, as I say, identified as Chaucer's scribe, almost certainly spent far more time on the production of documents like this than he ever did writing out verse by Chaucer. Millions of these documents were made. M.T. Clancy has observed that, supposing on average one charter was produced for each acre of arable land once in the 13th century, the number of charters made would then amount to approximately 8 million. Hundreds and thousands of these charters still survive, but they're very intractable for research use. Can a systematic digitisation program of material like this, where again the requirements will be very different to that of digitising a codex, make it easier to understand their scribal context and to extract information from them? There isn't time here to discuss the reasons for the persistence of the roll in medieval and early modern England and the more gradual adoption of the codex. It may perhaps be grounded in the origins of the codex in the early centuries as a format for Christian texts, whereas the roll and other secular formats were more explicitly associated with the exercise of secular power. But certainly we have not taken the importance of the roll and other formats into sufficient account in our discussions of digitization strategies. Whenever rolls are discussed in this context, it is usually as anomalies, seeming to pose difficult technical issues. This extraordinary picture shows the pioneering scholar of the medieval exchequer, Mabel Mills, reading a 14th century pipe roll on a specially designed stand. The pipe rolls are one of the oldest and most important English archival sequences, with the earliest pipe roll dating from 1130 and running in continuous sequence from 1155 to 1837. As the core document of exchequer accounting, they are crucial to analysing government finances. And as you can see from here, they are huge and extremely unwieldy documents. The stand being used by Mabel Mills was designed by the Pipe Roll Office in the early 19th century, and stands were still like this were still used to consult pipe rolls in the 1970s. And I can remember grappling with great difficulty with one of these stands in the Public Record Office at Chancery Lane in the 1970s. It was a physical labour trying to read a document on that. And part of what we might think about with these documents is simply the extent to which the physical labour of dealing with them might be reduced by digitisation. In the case of pipe rolls, and indeed many other key documents such as the common plea rolls we saw earlier, the first requirement of any digitisation is to make these heavy and cumbersome documents easier to consult. At present, the Anglo-American Legal Tradition website offers many digital images of pipe rolls in continuous sequence, but these in themselves are also very cumbersome to use. We need to give much more thought as to how we can best represent digitally documents of this sort, whose shape and character is very different to the codices that we have built much of our digitisation workflows around. The kind of deep zoom facility offered, for example, within IIIF digitisation might be very relevant here, but creating a high resolution image of such large documents remains problematic. In these cases, the aim would not at all be simply to replicate the physical experience of using the original, but actually the complete opposite. The physical experience of trying to use these documents is almost impossible. And in fact, what you want to do with digitalisation with these is to try and escape the physical problems that make these records so difficult to consult. We shouldn't consider series like the pipe rolls in isolation. All the various series of English royal government rolls cross-connect to other supporting roll and file series in quite complex, almost hypertextual fashions. Details of a single case, as in a law court, for example, might not only appear on the plea roll, but can be found on a supporting controlment roll. Moreover, all the original documents which form the basis of the indictments and were used for summoning parties and jurors might appear in file series such as the King's Bench Recorder and Penella series. So one needs to imagine the roll almost as part of a huge hypertextual cross-connection. Very much that's the case with the pipe rolls. For example, in this case, you can see an entry from one of the King's Bench plea rolls, which contains the confession of the leader of one of the rebels in Suffolk during the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, John Raw. And what's interesting in this particular extract is the way in which the scribe picks out the cross-references to where the supporting documents concerning different allegations against Raw can be found. And he picked out file series like the recorder file. And here is indeed the relevant bundle, recorder file from the King's Bench files, which contains all those supporting and much more informative documents relating to Royal's appeal. Because these file series contain the original documents behind the enrolled case, they're packed with fascinating information and a lot of new information. These are probably one of the richest archival series for discoveries, historical discoveries in the English medieval public records. However, these bundles, they're lots and lots of documents sewn together on a thong and wrapped around in parchment, are unconserved, and they're difficult to read even manually without damaging the document. Some of them are simply inaccessible. So if it's difficult enough to read manually, they're almost impossible to think about digitizing in a conventional way. And it's really with this image of the recorder file, the difficult, problematic, unconserved recorder file, that I'd like to leave you with as a conclusion, by way of reminding us that there are many more interesting and exciting digitization challenges than are apparent from our obsession with the codex. It's unlikely that there will ever be resources fully to conserve the King's Bench files and establish completely what extraordinary treasures of historical information lurk there. And I wonder if we could conceive of a project which images the documents contained in the file bundles without actually unwrapping them. After all, something very similar is already being successfully done with unopened, intercepted 17th century letters. It seems to me that looking at something like the recorder file is the kind of technically demanding challenge which will also enhance our knowledge of the nature of medieval scribal culture, which will reap great results for medieval students of the medieval age period of the sort that I would love to see us managing to address. Thank you very much.